In 1995, I was 15 years old. I lived alone with my mom as an only child. My mom's job kept her gone a lot. Usually she would come home very late in the evening, and sometimes she even had to go out of state for her job, so I was alone for days on end. While this may seem like every teen's dream come true, being an only child and being alone honestly wasn't very fun. I guess I was a fairly responsible teen though. Usually I didn't get into much trouble. After school, I would just put on my headphones and go for a long walk around the neighborhood before doing my homework, maybe watching some TV and going to bed. But there was one particular incident that year that I deeply regret. I got on the bus that morning, as I do most mornings, and was on the way to school when I heard a few of the kids talking about one of the little nerdy kids that everybody liked to pick on. His name was Jack. Jack had a blood disorder called hemophilia. For those of you that don't know what hemophilia is, it's a problem with your blood not being able to clot properly. So if someone with hemophilia were to get cut, it might take hours for that cut to stop bleeding. And if it's a severe enough cut, they could bleed out and possibly even die if it's severe enough. So of course, kids don't really fully comprehend this or feel much empathy, so they love to make fun of him and pick on him. He was sort of a nerdy guy who had this self-victimizing quality about him anyways, so he was really just kind of a target for a lot of bullies. So the kids that were making fun of him were of course calling him names and then wadding up pieces of paper and throwing it at him. And it was one of these wadded up pieces of paper that finally struck him in the head, and Jack turned around and stared right at me. I, of course, did not throw the piece of paper, but he thought that I did. So he looked right at me and he screamed, "Nice, asshole." And I said, "Dude, turn around, it wasn't me." To which he responded, "I know it was you, you stupid asshole." I don't know what it was, but that was enough to really irritate me. Not in some kind of maniacal, violent way, but in enough of a way to where I made up a little song for our dear Jack. I started singing, "Jack, Jack, he's a hemophiliac. Jack, Jack, he's a hemophiliac." Next thing you know, the entire bus started singing along to this little chant that I had just invented specifically for Jack. Surprisingly, the bus driver seemed completely oblivious to both the singing and the incident that had just transpired, and as the chanting continued, you could see Jack getting more and more ballistic. He was losing his mind, until finally he got up, ran over to me, and I don't know what he tried to do, punch me or slap me, I don't know, it was feeble one way or the other, and that was it. I finally lost it and did resort to violence. I stood straight up in his face and punched him as hard as I could. He fell on his back onto the bus floor, looked up at me with big wide eyes in shock, and at that exact moment I realized I sucked. I felt horrible. But before I could help him up, he got himself up and went back to his chair. And once again, surprisingly, the bus driver saw nothing, did nothing. I could not believe it. We both sat down, and for the rest of the day, all I thought about was what I did to Jack on the bus. I felt horrible. Honestly, I had never been a bully, and that was the first time I really resorted to being a bully with violence, and it just felt awful. I made up my mind after school I would go to his house, which I knew was about 5 houses from mine, and I would completely apologize and tell him it will never happen again. And so after school, that's exactly what I did. I went to Jack's house, I knocked on the door, he answered, and at first he looked scared, as though we were going to have a repeat of what happened on the bus, and I told him, "No man, I'm just here to say I'm sorry. I acted like a complete bully and a jerk. It will never happen again." Instead of saying anything mean back, he invited me to a game of chess. Now, I had never played chess, so he said, "Don't worry, I'll teach you." So teach me he did, and we sat there and played chess for a couple of hours. He beat me every single time, and I just looked at it like, hey, it's a little bit of payback for what I did to him earlier in the day. But it wasn't chess that had my attention. It was the stories he was telling me about something in the neighborhood. Jack told me that down one of the streets in the neighborhood, it leads to a cul-de-sac that borders the forest. He said that beyond that forest is an abandoned oil field that a lot of the kids go and explore. He told me that there are some incredible and creepy stories that took place in that oil field. The more Jack spoke about the oil fields, the more I realized it is something I absolutely have to explore. He talked about bubbling oil still coming up from the sand where they allegedly covered up their spills or covered up their chemicals in such a hurry to where they didn't do it properly. So over the years, these chemicals and oil seeped up and made iridescent colors and bubbles, and it was very, very eerie to look at. He also talked about lots of equipment that was left behind that's rusted and mostly useless, but a lot of things were still intact. He said there were several homes that had lab equipment in them that were obviously part of the site. He talked about a pond, and the pond at night had a red glowing light source down inside of it. He had so many stories, but you had to understand this was Jack telling the story. Jack was an intellectual, nerdy kind of guy, and he had this monotone way of speaking. It was a very matter-of-fact way. He wasn't hyper-emotional, and so his stories were incredibly believable. Though they weren't his own experiences, you could tell he believed what he was saying. He went on to tell stories that seemed too fantastic to be true. Everything from aliens to ghosts to homeless psychopaths living in the woods, preying on any children that entered. And it was at that point that I sort of started tuning him out. But in the back of my head, I thought it definitely sounds interesting enough to go check out. I made a mental note of where Jack had said the entrance to the forest is that led to the oil fields, and decided that one day very soon I would go explore the oil field. Days went by and I had mostly forgotten about the oil fields until another kid at school started talking about it. He started talking about some ghost story in the oil fields, and they were talking about going out and having a campfire and trying to have a seance or something like that. I wasn't interested in anything supernatural. I don't believe in that type of thing, but I did ask him more about the oil fields. And I told him I was thinking about going out and exploring it by myself. He looked a little surprised and said, "Do not go in those oil fields by yourself." And I asked him why. And his reason why was a very credible one. He said that the police are around that area a lot, not in the oil fields, but around the entrance at the cul-de-sac. He said that a lot of criminals from the city use the oil fields to enter into the neighborhood unnoticed and then rob houses. So the cops watch that area, and if you're just a teenager trying to get to the oil fields, a lot of times they'll stop you and just tell you to go home. So now I was very curious about this place. Criminal activity, bubbling goo coming up from the ground, glowing orbs in the ponds. It just sounded too good to be true. The next day, I did something that I had never done before. I ditched school. I got up about 9 o'clock and decided I was going to the oil fields. I was going to spend the day there, in fact. I found my way to the cul-de-sac, and there was the wooded entrance. And about maybe 100 meters, maybe 150 meters into the forest, it opened up into this massive field. And there it was, the oil field. There was everything that Jack had said. There was old equipment, huge tanks, even some like a broken down bulldozer. There was a pond. There was bubbling goo coming up in about a maybe 200, 300 square foot area. There was weird sandy surface with this iridescent, glistening top surface and bubbles coming up. It was amazing. The pond was very amazing. There were actually clams or oysters. I don't know the difference, but there was actually clams there around the shore of the pond, which I didn't even know was possible. I left the pond and just went exploring. I went down many trails. Every trail led to something amazing. There were abandoned houses back there with lab equipment in them. I spent over 3 hours just exploring and exploring. I never saw another kid. I never saw anyone until I did. It was about noon, I believe, and I was headed back home. I had explored a lot of the oil fields, and it was every bit as amazing as I thought. As I approached the pond on the way out of the oil fields, I noticed two figures around the pond. I immediately ducked down. I don't know why, it was just an instinct. And what I saw confused me. These two people were in full hazmat gear. From head to toe, they were covered, from gloves to complete body coverings and the stereotypical gas mask looking face gear. And they appeared to be taking samples from the pond and putting the samples into this little box that they had. I watched them for about 10 minutes until they finally collected their samples and left. They didn't leave through the entrance that I thought was the only entrance to the oil fields. They went down a trail on the backside of the pond that I didn't even know existed. I kind of chuckled a bit. The sight was so bizarre. The oil fields were so bizarre. And here were these guys probably taking chemical samples to make sure that the pond wasn't too polluted so it wouldn't make people sick, or I didn't know what to think, but I thought it looked pretty routine for the surroundings. I mean, this was an oil field, and obviously it was irresponsibly cleaned up before it was abandoned. So it made sense to me that maybe people were out here, maybe the state or government was out here taking samples, making sure that it wasn't toxic for the public. But it was still very, very weird. Later that night, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept thinking about the creepy hazmat guys around that pond in those oil fields. It was about 1 a.m, and I just couldn't stop thinking about it. About 2 a.m, I realized I'm not going to sleep. So I decided I would go back to the oil fields. I wasn't afraid of anything supernatural because I didn't believe in it, but what I was interested in was this glow that was supposedly coming from the pond at night. I made my way to the cul-de-sac and looked to make sure there wasn't any cops guarding the entrance, and then made my way into the oil fields. It was a full moon out, or at least I remember it being a full moon. It might not have been a full moon, but the moon was out sufficiently to light a lot of the area. And I made my way to the pond. As soon as I got to the pond, I noticed there was a faint red glow emanating from it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. It wasn't bright like in Jack's story, but it was there. There was a glow. And the more I focused on it, the more I realized there really was a red glow in the pond. But looking at this strange aura coming from the pond, it gave you the impression that this pond was very deep. The pond only was maybe 300 feet in circumference, not anywhere near big enough to be as deep as what it appeared. The light appeared to be coming from extremely deep into this pond, which led me to believe maybe the pond was not a pond at all. Maybe it was a shaft that was used for drilling oil or something deep in the ground that just filled with water. It creeped me out so badly that between just the general atmosphere of the oil fields with the guys I had seen in hazmat gear earlier in the day, and then the glowing pond being real, it was enough to make me go home. I went home and went fast to sleep. I tried to forget all about the oil fields, and eventually I did. At least once a year, maybe twice a year, I think back to my experience in the oil fields. It was a very, very creepy thing, and it was something I'll never forget. But one thing about the oil fields is greatly disturbing, and I can never get it out of my head. I can never prove it, and it's just a theory. But I can't help but think all those stories about stalkers in the forest, and aliens, and ghosts, and glowing orbs in the pond. What if these poor kids were experiencing hallucinations from the irresponsibly cleaned up chemicals that were still present in the ground and in the air in those oil fields? That thought creeped me out more than all of the other experiences combined.